Let's go back. Far, far back. Long before museums, long before textbooks, long before the word Africa even existed. Let's journey back to the Nile. This wasn't just a river, it was the lifeline of a civilization, the world's longest river, flowing like a silver snake through desert gold. On both sides of that river, there was life. Green fields stretched to the horizon. Papyrus reeds swayed gently in the wind. Farmers were busy planting grain, their hands deep in the rich, dark soil. Children ran barefoot through the mud, their laughter echoing across the water. Boats, sleek and silent, slid across the river's surface, carrying goods and people from one bank to another. And rising above it all were the monuments. Massive, silent, unshakable. Temples carved directly from mountainsides, their entrances looming like gateways to another world. Obelisks, single shafts of stone, reached toward the sky as if trying to touch the sun god Ra himself. Colossal statues stood watch over entire cities, their stone faces, some 50 feet tall, gazing out with an eternal, knowing expression. This was a civilization so advanced, so organized, and so powerful that even today, with all our modern technology, we still don't fully understand how they built it all. This was the land of Kemet, what we now call Egypt. But here's something crucial to understand. Ancient Egypt wasn't separate from Africa. It wasn't some isolated island, and it certainly wasn't a southern outpost of Mediterranean Europe. It was African. Geographically, it's rooted in the northeast corner of the continent. Culturally, its traditions and innovations were deeply intertwined with its neighbors. Genetically, its people were indigenous to the land, and spiritually, its beliefs were part of a wider African cosmology. It was connected south to the powerful kingdom of Nubia, connected west to the cultures of the Sahara, connected to the very heartbeat of the entire continent. And the people, the original people of Kemet, they looked like the land they came from. They were people of the sun. Their skin was kissed dark by its powerful rays. Their features were strong, reflecting the resilience of a people who built an empire from the desert. They had broad noses, full lips, and tightly curled hair. You don't have to take my word for it. The evidence is carved in stone. The statues, the reliefs, the paintings, they show it clearly. Before the damage, before the invading armies arrived with their chisels, before the deliberate erasures began, the stone told the truth. The faces of the pharaohs, the queens, the priests, and the everyday people reflected their African origins. Then came the invaders, the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, then the Greeks, led by Alexander, and after them, the Romans. Each wave of conquest brought new rulers, new cultures, and new faces. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which included Cleopatra, were Greek rulers. They ruled from Egypt, but they were not of Egypt. They brought their own art styles, their own language for government, and their own worldview. Over centuries, the population of Lower Egypt, especially around the new capital of Alexandria, began to change. Intermingling was inevitable. The original Kemetic identity didn't vanish overnight, but it was slowly, systematically, buried. The Romans solidified this shift. They treated Egypt as a breadbasket, a province to be exploited. The cultural center of gravity shifted further, toward the Mediterranean, and with the rise of Christianity and later Islam, the ancient religion, the hieroglyphic language, and the pharaonic traditions faded into memory. The great temples were abandoned or converted. The old ways were forgotten. This wasn't just a change of government. It was a cultural erasure. The connection to its deep African roots was deliberately severed. Scholars from Europe arrived centuries later and saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, and they couldn't, or wouldn't, reconcile these incredible achievements with the African people they saw around them. So they created a new story. A story that placed Egypt firmly in a new category. The Orient, the Middle East, or even a misplaced extension of Europe. They chiseled the noses off statues to obscure their features. They categorized and racialized the people, claiming the rulers were a different, lighter-skinned race than the masses they governed. This academic sleight of hand was the final erasure, writing the true identity of Kemet out of its own history. The civilization that was born from the heart of Africa was repackaged and sold to the world as something else entirely. But the stones remember. The genetics don't lie. And the spirit of Kemet, the great African civilization of the Nile, is a truth that can no longer be buried. Picture a sculptor standing in the heat, chisel in one hand, hammer in the other. Before him sits a massive block of black granite. He isn't just guessing what a king looks like. He is not inventing a fantasy. He is carving someone he has seen, someone he knows. Maybe it's someone he's stood next to, or even someone he bows to every day. Every single strike of his hammer is intentional. Every curve is deliberate. The cheekbones, the eyes, the lips, and especially the nozzle, carefully shaped, proud, and distinct. Why is this so important? Because in ancient cultures, art was documentation. It recorded reality. These statues weren't cartoons or abstract interpretations. They were portraits, meant to capture the true likeness of a person. This leads us to a powerful conclusion. If thousands of ancient statues clearly show African features, that wasn't symbolism. It was observation. It was truth, frozen in stone for millennia. This brings us to a critical question. If this evidence is so clear, why isn't it common knowledge? The answer lies in the history of invaders, empires, and the first erasures. When one culture conquers another, it doesn't just take land and resources. It often seeks to rewrite history, to erase the identity of the conquered people. One of the most effective ways to do this is to destroy their art, their records, their statues. Think about it. If you can break the nose off a statue, you can obscure its features. You can create ambiguity. You can begin to plant a new narrative. Consider the great library of Alexandria, a treasure trove of ancient knowledge, burned to the ground, or the countless artifacts looted from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, now sitting in museums far from their homes, their original context lost. This isn't accidental. It's a systematic process of cultural erasure. When invaders deface a statue, they are not just breaking stone. They are trying to break the link between a people and their past. They are trying to say, you are not who you think you were. Your ancestors did not look like this. Your achievements are not your own. This is why those noses are so often missing from ancient Egyptian and Nubian statues. It was a deliberate act to obscure the African identity of these powerful civilizations. The goal was to disconnect them from their legacy, to make it easier to claim their achievements as the product of another people. By erasing the face of the past, you can control the narrative of the present and the future. This pattern isn't unique to one time or place. It has happened all over the world. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they destroyed Aztec and Incan codices, burning centuries of history and knowledge. They replaced indigenous temples with churches, superimposing their own culture over the one that existed before. The message was clear. Your history starts with us, but history is resilient. Truth has a way of enduring, even when it's been buried under layers of falsehoods. The evidence is still there, in the statues that survived, in the fragments of texts that were saved, in the oral traditions passed down through generations. The features are still visible, even on a broken statue. The language still holds clues. The DNA still tells a story. Our job now is to be historical detectives. It's to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, to question the narratives we've been taught, and to piece together the truth that was so deliberately shattered. We must ask why certain histories have been suppressed and others promoted. We must reconnect the dots that were intentionally broken. When we see a statue with a broken nose, we shouldn't just see vandalism. We should see an attempt to erase the history. We should see the ghosts of an empire trying to rewrite its own story by destroying someone else's. And by understanding this, by recognizing the act of erasure, we take the first step in reclaiming that history. We honor the sculptor who stood in the heat, carefully carving the truth into stone. We give voice to the ancestors whose faces were stolen. We begin to understand that the story of humanity is far richer, more diverse, and more interconnected than the history books have often led us to believe. The stones still speak, if we only learn how to listen. But history is never peaceful for long, because whenever a civilization becomes wealthy, powerful, and admired, someone else always wants it. And the Nile Valley, the land the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, was rich beyond imagination. It wasn't just about gold, though they had mountains of it, mined from the eastern deserts. It wasn't just about the precious ivory traded up from the heart of Africa. It was so much more. The Nile's annual flood made their land incredibly fertile, producing a surplus of grain that could feed their people and be traded across the ancient world. This abundance created stability, and from that stability grew something even more valuable: knowledge. They developed sophisticated trade routes that became the arteries of commerce, connecting Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Their priests and scribes charted the stars, developing a calendar so accurate it formed the basis of the one we use today. This was astronomy born from necessity, used to predict the floods and guide their agricultural society. Their understanding of medicine was legendary. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, details their knowledge of surgery, pharmacology, and anatomy, showing a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. And then there was their architecture, the pyramids, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Sphinx. These weren't just buildings, they were statements of power, faith, and cosmic order, engineered with a precision that still baffles us. They were masters of stone, creating monuments designed to last for eternity. So, to the outside world, to the burgeoning kingdoms and nomadic tribes that surrounded them, Kemet wasn't just impressive. It was irresistible. It was a beacon of wealth, a treasure house of wisdom, and a symbol of ultimate power. And as history teaches us time and time again, irresistible things attract invaders. The first major foreign power to successfully conquer parts of Egypt were the Hyksos, a people from Western Asia, around 1650 BCE. They swept in, bringing with them new military technologies like the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot, things the Egyptians had never seen before. They established their own dynasty in the Nile Delta, ruling over Lower Egypt for more than a century. For the proud Egyptians, this was a profound shock, a deep humiliation. The divine order, the concept of Mat that governed their worldview, had been shattered. But this invasion also planted a seed. It forced the Egyptians to adapt, to learn from their conquerors. They adopted the chariot, mastered the composite bow, and fundamentally transformed their military. When the Theban princes in the south finally rose up and drove the Hyksos out, Egypt was not the same. It was stronger, more militarized, and more determined than ever to prevent such a violation from happening again. This experience led to the birth of the new kingdom, the Age of Empire. This was the era of warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great. They didn't just wait for invaders to come to them. They projected their power outwards. They marched their new, formidable armies into the Levant, into Nubia, creating a buffer zone and establishing an empire that stretched from modern-day Sudan to Syria. They weren't just defending their wealth anymore. They were actively seizing the resources and tribute of other nations to fuel their own grand projects back home. The temples grew larger, the tombs more elaborate, and the treasury overflowed with foreign gold. But empires are difficult and expensive to maintain, and Egypt's wealth continued to be a magnet. From the west came the Libyans, who at times managed to take the throne itself. From the south, the Nubian kings of Kush, once Egypt's subjects, rose to conquer their former masters, establishing their own dynasty as the 25th dynasty of pharaohs. They saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of traditional Egyptian values. Then came the great powers of the age. The vast Assyrian Empire, with its brutal and efficient military machine, swept down from Mesopotamia, sacking the great city of Thebes. They were followed by the even larger Persian Empire under Cambyses II, who defeated the last native Egyptian pharaoh and incorporated the land of the Nile into his immense domain. For the first time, the pharaoh was a foreigner living in a distant capital. And finally, Alexander the Great arrived. After defeating the Persians, he was welcomed in Egypt as a liberator. He respected their culture, was crowned pharaoh, and founded the city of Alexandria, which would become the new center of learning and culture in the Mediterranean. After his death, his general, Ptolemy, took control, establishing a Greek-speaking dynasty that would rule Egypt for 300 years, culminating in its most famous figure, Cleopatra. Through all of this, a slow and subtle process was taking place. Each wave of invaders, each new empire, brought their own language, their own gods, their own culture. While Egyptian culture was remarkably resilient, influencing its conquerors as much as it was influenced, the old ways began to fade. The Greek language of the Ptolemies, and later the Latin of the Romans, became the languages of administration. New religions, particularly Christianity and later Islam, began to supplant the ancient pantheon of gods. The final blow came when the ability to read hieroglyphs was lost, a key turning off the lights of a 3,000-year-old civilization. The voices of the pharaohs fell silent. This is the story of the first great cultural erasure in history. It wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding process of conquest, assimilation, and forgetting. The wealth and knowledge that made Kemet so irresistible ultimately led to its downfall as an independent culture, but its legacy never truly died. It was preserved in stone, in papyrus, and in the DNA of later civilizations. The Greeks, the Romans, and all who followed stood on the shoulders of these African giants. The story of ancient Egypt is a powerful lesson in how greatness can invite its own destruction, and how a culture can be erased, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later. First came the wars. It started small, with neighboring kingdoms just testing the borders, skirmishes kicking up dust along the desert edges. But then, the forces grew larger. Foreign armies started appearing on the horizon, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, and carrying very different ambitions. First, it was the Assyrians, then the Persians. After them, the Greeks, and then the Romans. It was wave after wave, century after century. Each new power arrived with the exact same thought. This land, this civilization, is just too valuable to be left alone. And so, they conquered. They ruled. They marched into the capital, replaced the leaders, and planted their own flags. They renamed the cities, trying to make the foreign feel familiar. But every single time power changed hands, something else changed too. Something less obvious than a name on a map. Memory. Because conquerors don't just take land, they take the story that goes with it. They rewrite history to place themselves at the center. And this is exactly where statues become dangerous. Why? Because statues remember. Long after the kings have died and their bodies have turned to dust, the stone still speaks. Long after the armies have packed up and marched away, the monuments still stand, silent witnesses to what came before. A statue is more than just a carving. It's a declaration. It says, this person ruled here. It says, this culture thrived here. It says, these people built this. And if you're a new conqueror trying to claim all that glory for yourself, that's a huge problem. The physical evidence completely contradicts your new narrative. You can't stand in a grand hall and say, we built this glorious empire from nothing, while the faces of hundreds of African kings and queens stare back at you from the temple walls. You can't proclaim your own unmatched greatness while someone else's powerful face dominates the skyline. So, what do? You can't destroy everything. That would take far too much time, too much effort. It's impractical. Instead, you get strategic. You target identity itself. You attack the face. You see, a statue without a face is anonymous. It's a ghost. You can chip away at the nose, the lips, the eyes, the very features that give it a personal story. Bidongtisyo. Not just vandalizing a piece of art, you're performing a targeted assassination of history. You're trying to erase a person from time itself. Imagine walking through a temple and seeing row after row of powerful figures, all of them systematically defeated. The message is clear. The people who came before don't matter anymore. Their legacy is cancelled. The new rulers are sending a powerful signal to the conquered people. Your heroes are gone. Your history is void, and your identity is now ours to define. It's a psychological tactic, a way to break the spirit of a civilization by severing its connection to its own past. And this wasn't a one-time thing. It happened again and again with each new empire that swept through. Each conqueror would see the monuments of the last and think, I can't let their story overshadow mine. So, they'd continue the cycle of erasure. They would chisel away at the symbols of their predecessors, all while erecting their own new statues, knowing full well that their monuments might face the same fate one day. This is why, when we look at ancient artifacts today, we see so many damaged faces. It's not always the result of time or accidents. Often, it's the scar tissue of history, the physical evidence of a long and brutal war over memory itself. The story of these invaders is not just about battles and territory. It's about the deliberate, systematic effort to control the past as a way of controlling the present and the future. They knew that if you can erase a people's history, you can control their destiny. But as these statues show, even in their damaged state, they still tell a powerful story of resilience, a story that refuses to be completely silenced. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more stories hidden in history. The face is personal. The face is human. It tells you who someone is, where they come from, what their story is. But what happens when you change the face? When you remove a crucial part, like Tanos? Suddenly, the features blur. The story changes. And that's exactly what some people wanted. For centuries, we've looked at ancient Egyptian statues with their noses and lips deliberately broken off. And for just as long, historians have used this damage to create doubt. They'd say things like, well, maybe they looked different. Maybe they weren't actually African. Maybe we're just not sure. Maybe. Maybe becomes a weapon. Doubt is a powerful tool, because once a people begin to doubt their own past, they start to doubt themselves, their capabilities, their heritage, their place in the world. This wasn't accidental damage. It was a targeted act of erasure. Imagine this scene. An invading soldier, centuries ago, stands in the grand hall of an ancient temple. Dust motes dance in the flickering torchlight. All around him, towering statues of pharaohs and gods, carved from dark, formidable stone, stand silent. They are watching in their presence. He feels small, insignificant. These monuments, these silent giants, scream a powerful truth at him. You are not the first here. You are not the greatest here. Someone came before you. Someone stronger. Someone more brilliant. And that truth threatens his entire sense of superiority, the very foundation of his conquest. So, what does he do? He can't topple the entire statue, it's too massive. But he can disfigure it. He can rob it of its identity. He picks up a heavy mallet or a hammer. He steps up to the stone face, raises his arm, and brings it down with force. Crack. Stone chips fly. He strikes again. Crack. And again. He focuses his energy on the most defining features. The broad nose. Tiffle leaps. He hammers away until the nose collapses, until the face is a ghost of its former self, until its identity is shattered. This wasn't just random vandalism. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Every broken nose sent a clear, brutal message to the conquered people. It said, your gods are powerless. Your kings are dead and defeated. Your history, your memory, your identity. It all ends here. By erasing the face, the invaders tried to erase the people. They understood something fundamental. To control the future, you must first control the past. They didn't just break stone. They were trying to break a spirit, to sever a connection to a glorious legacy that they could never claim as their own. But legacies are resilient. The truth is written in stone, and even when chipped and broken, it refuses to be completely silenced. These statues, even in their damaged state, still tell a story. They tell a story of greatness, and they tell a story of the desperate, violent attempts to hide that greatness from the world. We are now piecing that story back together, looking past the damage to see the truth that was always there. The faces may have been attacked, but the spirit behind them was never truly broken. Now, multiply that moment by thousands, across centuries, across temples, tombs, and entire cities. This was systematic, repeated, intentional. This wasn't just one angry person acting out in a single moment of rage. No, this was a pattern, a behavior, a deliberate strategy, because every conqueror, every invader understood something very simple, something fundamental. If you control the past, you control the future. And for centuries, This was the primary method of control. Armies would sweep through, bringing down monuments, defacing statues, and burning libraries. It was a physical conquest, a brute force attempt to rewrite history by destroying the evidence. But then came something even more devastating. Not just invasion, not just conquest, but colonization. This was a different kind of control. It wasn't waged with swords, but with narratives. Not with armies, but with textbooks. It wasn't about destruction alone, it was about distortion. Because centuries later, after the initial waves of physical destruction had settled, Europe would look back at Africa and say something truly outrageous. A statement so bold, so fundamentally untrue, it's hard to comprehend. They would say, Africa has no history, no civilization, no great achievements. Think about that for a second. Imagine standing in front of the pyramids of Giza, structures older than the city of Rome itself, and declaring that the people who built them had no history. Imagine saying that while walking through the grand temples of Karnak or Abu Simbel, complexes carved from mountains with a precision that baffles engineers even today, and claiming there were no great achievements. Imagine holding intricate artifacts crafted by master engineers, astronomers, and artists, and dismissing them as primitive. How could such an audacious lie possibly take hold? How could it become the dominant narrative for so long? Well, the lie only works if the evidence is damaged, if the stories are silenced, if the faces are gone. The lie becomes plausible only if the identity of the creators is blurred, made ambiguous, or erased entirely. The lie only works if the noses are missing. This wasn't just about breaking stones. It was about breaking a connection. It was an attempt to sever a people from their heritage, to make them forget who they were and what their ancestors accomplished. If you can convince a people that they have no past worth remembering, you can more easily convince them that they have no future worth fighting for. The physical erasure was the first step. The second was the psychological one. The rewriting of history books, the creation of a global story where one continent was the hero and another was a blank page, waiting to be written upon. But history is resilient. Truth, even when buried, has a way of resurfacing. The stones still speak, even when they're broken. The art still tells a story, even when it's defaced. The achievements are still there, etched into the very landscape, waiting for us to look past the damage and see the original masterpiece. The story of what was lost is just as important as the story of what was built, because it teaches us about the enduring power of culture and the desperate lengths some will go to extinguish it. Reclaiming that history, piece by broken piece, isn't just about correcting the past. It's about building a more honest future. So now we know something important. The vandalism didn't start randomly. It began with power, with fear, with conquerors trying to erase the people they replaced. We've seen how empires rose and fell, and how new rulers often tried to wipe the slate clean by literally defacing the past. They hammered away at the images of old gods, chiseled off the names of forgotten kings, and tore down monuments to build their own. It was a brutal, physical act of rewriting history, a declaration that screamed, "We are in charge now. You are forgotten." This was the first wave of erasure, born from the battlefield and the thirst for dominance. But what happens next is even more shocking, because the story doesn't end there. In fact, it takes a turn that's quieter, more insidious, and arguably even more devastating. Because later, the destruction wouldn't just happen on battlefields. It would happen in museums, in excavations, in so-called scientific studies. The very places we trust to protect and explain history became the new front lines for its alteration. Think about that for a second. The damage was no longer done with the crude force of a soldier's hammer, but with the precise tools of an archaeologist, the pen of a historian, or the authority of a curator. It happened in the name of research, in the name of preserving history. And sometimes, the people claiming to save and celebrate African heritage were the very ones reshaping it, chiseling it, editing it, and hiding it from public view. They weren't just digging up artifacts. They were digging up narratives and then reburying the parts they didn't like or couldn't understand. And that's where this story gets really uncomfortable, because the next suspects in our investigation don't look like ancient warriors. They wear suits, not armor. They hold degrees, not spears. And their tools aren't swords and shields. They're narratives, they're theories, they're the stories we are told in textbooks and the labels we read in museum halls. The power to erase history shifted from the conqueror to the academic, from the battlefield to the lecture hall. These new gatekeepers of the past decided what was important, what was authentic, and what was best left unsaid. And in doing so, they continued a different kind of vandalism, a cultural erasure that could be just as permanent. Stay with us as we uncover how these modern narratives were constructed and who was left out of the picture.